Hi, my name is Charlotte Armitage and this is Objects. Objects is a podcast that takes you on a journey through before, during and after care, using the objects that mean the most to care experienced people. Who Cares Scotland is inviting you to come on this journey with us by listening to our podcast. Welcome to Objects, a Who Cares Scotland podcast. Today I'm joined by Kirsty Capes. Kirsty grew up in care in Surrey. She is now 30 and works in marketing and lives in Slough. She has a PhD from Brunel University London. Her thesis investigated representations of care in contemporary British fiction. Her first novel, Careless, followed a young girl grown up in care who falls pregnant at the age of 15. It was longlisted for a Women's Prize in 2022. Welcome, Kirsty.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so as you said, I grew up in care. I went into care at 2 and then I stayed in care until I aged out, which I think was something like 23 because I stayed in education, so I still had support, I think up to 23 or 25 or something like that. And yeah, I did creative writing at university, and in my writing I was really interested in writing about the care experience and kind of trying to process some of my own experience through the creative work.
Yep.
So that's really where I started in terms of my writing and my books, and then kind of just went on from there, really, kept writing. And then I have a day job as well, and my day job is marketing.
Exciting. And that's kind of what this process is as well, isn't it? It's like processing your own experience of care in a creative format and going through it. That's kind of the feedback that we've had from guests that we've had so far. So, thank you for joining us. It'll be quite interesting for you, I think, to go through that process in a different way outside of writing it yourself. So before we move on to the first object representing before care, I'm interested to hear a little bit what it was like finding them. Did you have a kind of process? Was it something that was easy for you? How was that process?
Yeah, so I think I was sort of stuck between two sort of routes, if you like, in terms of what I wanted to talk about and the objects I wanted to bring. And I thought about, you know, the things that were important to me in my life and what I felt represented something about my experience, but also represented me. And to be honest, I really struggled. I found it quite hard, especially before care and during care, because, you know, for the before care object, which we'll talk about, I don't have anything. So I was like, what can I bring? Because there's so little. So I really had to think about that, and then also think about, okay, what can I talk about in a way that's going to be interesting to you and interesting to your listeners as well. And I think the thing that kind of is a thread through all of the work that I do with Who Cares Scotland and also just generally around the care experience is very much about storytelling and, you know, people who have been in care or experienced care being able to tell their own stories and, you know, not rely on the kind of tropes that we see time and again in the media, you know, the kind of statistical talking points that we get a lot. So that's kind of the road that I went down with my objects. I just thought about, okay, how do I tell the story of me and my life? And that's where I ended up.
Oh, brilliant. And yeah, I think the thing is it's not every single person that comes onto this is going to have like such uniquely different objects for them, and because it's tied to that thread of who you are and also representing each point of your life. You know, you said you went into care when you were 2. It's quite hard to find something that represents a period when you're a toddler,
exactly.
Especially if you've not got that nuclear family that will make sure that you have those objects and keep those objects. So and that's kind of the beauty of the podcast, is it's telling those stories. People that don't know someone that's been in care won't understand that, and they won't know, you know, that it's on the sort of onus of your parents to make sure you've got these things from when you're a kid, and we don't have that opportunity. So on that, tell us a little bit about your first object that you did decide to bring, and how that represents your time before care.
Yeah, okay, so the object that I brought for before care, it's representative of something. So I've got some stuffing, which is stuffing that goes into stuffed toys, which I thought, actually looking behind you at your banner, was relevant as well when I walked in. So one of the things that I did have when I went into care was a stuffed toy, and it was Simba from The Lion King, and it was just like that big. It was quite small. And I was obsessed with it. I was also obsessed with Disney when I was really young and going into care. And I remember I was convinced when I went into my second placement, I was convinced that Cruella de Vil lived downstairs. And I was really scared to go downstairs by myself because I was like, Cruella de Vil's going to get me. So yeah, I think I internalized Disney a bit too much. But so I had this stuffed toy, which was just a Simba toy. And I think it was like kind of a comfort blanket for me. It was something that I carried around with me all the time. And it got wrecked over the years that I had it. So at one point it just had a massive splodge of jam on the front of it that I don't think it ever went through the wash or anything like that. Yeah. So it was a right state. And I held on to that. And then when I was maybe like 14 or 15, we got a German Shepherd, and my German Shepherd found my Simba toy and shredded it. So now this is not stuffing from Simba. My partner does crafts, and he creates like plushies and stuff. So he gave me some stuffing to bring, which I thought was representative of, that object that I had when I was going into care. But yeah, I did, as I said, I found it really hard because there's so little. I have a few photos, I think. And that is about it. So, yeah, I that's what I landed on.
Yeah, and I think that's still quite powerful in itself. Saying, you know, I did have something that I could carry with me, but no longer have it. And here's something that is a part of you now, your partner's business, and bringing that together is quite powerful in itself.
Yeah, for sure. And I think he helped me as well, because before I came on, I was talking to him and just saying, I've got no idea what to bring because I have nothing. And I think, you know, bringing photos and things like that, a lot of the photos are not like positive memories for me.
Okay.
So I didn't want to bring photos. And then we were talking about my old Simba toy, and he said, why don't you just bring some stuffing? Yeah. Which I thought was quite poetic. So.
Yeah, no, for sure, absolutely. Especially because it was something that, even though you've not got it now, you did have it until you were 15. That's quite a long time for someone to have a teddy in general, but like for it to have survived that long, considering you were taken into care when you were 2. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah,
that's really special.
Yeah, stayed with me for a long time.
Yeah,
until it met its end.
Yeah, so I suppose you kind of brought this in to talk about before care, but it does in a way talk about during care as well. It's something that came with you into your time in care, and unfortunately met its end when you were in care. But let's move on to the second object and talk about your time in care, seeing as we've had that sort of like through roads with this podcast episode, with this object, not episode.
So this is kind of a weird one as well, which is more like a figurative thing rather than the actual thing. And so I brought my care records with me. I don't have physical copies of my care records because they are thousands and thousands of pages, and they were sent to me in like PDF installments. So rather than print out pages and pages, I've brought my laptop, and they're on my laptop, and I'll show you some of them. But yeah, so my care records, I decided to sort of start undergoing the process of getting my care records from the local authority maybe when I was about 19 or 20, and it was something I'd thought about for a really long time. And I'd listened to Lem Cisse talk about it, and seen him speak about it and how powerful it was for him, but also quite a difficult experience too. And I think talking to other care experienced people, it seems to be like the through line that it is a really difficult experience, kind of, and can be re-traumatizing as well. So I wanted my care records because, as I said, there was so little I knew about life before care, but also in the very early years of when I was in care. I didn't, I'd heard things from my foster carers. I was taken into care with my brother, so he knew things. He was a bit older than me, but I didn't have a real sort of sense of what happened and how it happened, and the key players, if you like, in what went on. And I think my own memory was very fractured as well, which I think is quite common with care experienced people, because so much of our early childhood memories are kind of reified by our family and the people around us who remember them. So there's this kind of collective memory in the family unit where people tell stories to each other over many, many years, and the stories change and the memories change as a result of that. And for me, there wasn't really anyone around me who could do that. So where there might have been like a collective familial memory where there was kind of a lore around the family and growing up, I didn't really have that. So I kind of had to think about, okay, what is my story, and how can I tell it, and how can I kind of make these memories for myself in a way. So that's kind of how I came to start the process of getting my care records. And it was a really long process, which I was surprised about. I think it took about 2 or 3 years to get all of them. I don't know if that's common or not with other care experienced people.
I think it is. Certainly from my own experience, it took me, and I was in care for a lot less time, and it was still 1.5 years, 2 years to get my record. So I think it is quite common.
And I think a lot of it was actually they spent a lot of time redacting everything.
That is what it is.
So, God bless GDPR. But so it was kind of I put in the request, and I got, like, at the end of the month, the monthly instalment of what I assume what they had worked on that month, and it was all kind of scanned and digitized and sent to me. And what I got didn't really answer any questions for me. A lot of it was redacted. A lot of it was like really fractured information that didn't really like hold any meaning at all. And then another thing that I found quite interesting was there was a lot of negative language used about me when I was really young. And I found that really difficult to read, actually, because I think it kind of presented this like version of me that I didn't identify in myself. And it was kind of care professionals' version of me that, it wasn't anything that I saw in myself. So it was a really challenging process. And I'm glad I did it, because I do have those records now, and I've gone through some of it, not all of it, but I think if there is ever a time where I want to sit down and go through everything, I have it now, and I can do that kind of on my own terms.
Yeah, exactly, for sure. I think it's never going to be something that happens just all at once anyway, because of what you just talked about. That perspective from someone else doesn't necessarily ring true to how you even remember it. As you said, that you've kind of got a bit of a fragmented memory, but even then the fragments that you do pick up and remember don't necessarily match up with the way that the social worker or the care worker describes what happened.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult process to go through, because how do you make sense of that, you know?
Exactly. And I think the other thing I noticed was that a lot of my behaviour was pathologized really quickly. Mm-hmm. So, you know, there are parts of the records where when I'm sort of like 15 or 16, and actually I do have better memories of those times, so I can kind of point them out and go, no, I don't think that's what happened.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of talk about like compulsive lying, disobeying the rules, weirdly overly sexualized behavior, which I found that was really hard to read. You know, inappropriate relationships with boys, things like that. And that's really heavy stuff to say about like a 15, 16-year-old girl.
Yeah.
And reading that, I was kind of like, is this, you know, symptoms of, you know, someone who is like a bad kid or is, you know, processing trauma in like unhealthy ways, or is it just a teenager that's playing up?
Yeah.
And, you know, when I was in care with a family who had biological children as well, so there were foster kids and biological kids in the family, and I sort of thought about, well, if, you know, my sister was behaving like that at 16 or 17, which she did, you know, she did not have a report written about her by a social worker, and she wasn't, you know, no one had to come up with strategies for dealing with her behaviour, or no one labelled it like an attachment disorder or anything like that. So that to me was like really interesting, like the pathologization of, you know, what I was doing when I was that age. And I think sometimes there's like an eagerness to jump to that to kind of explain behaviour, when actually sometimes it's not something that needs to be addressed. Sometimes it's just a person going through like a normal...
Sure. And I my reflection on that when I was looking through it for myself was, and you might disagree about this, but it was more about the system kind of trying to protect itself.
Yeah.
Viewing it in that kind of way, like, and it wasn't necessarily about what my behaviour was, but it was kind of that over-exerting to make sure that something didn't go wrong, and they'd got it sort of all in a trail pair. Like, do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That,
I've
like,
never thought
bubble
about
wrapping
it.
of the situation, just to make sure
everyone's covered. And
then there's a paper trail in case something did necessarily happen. But I think it is exactly what you said. It's, you know, there's a real difference between a traumatized child who needs the support and someone that's been in care and is actually just acting like a normal teenager.
Yeah, exactly. It's really interesting you say that, actually, because I've never thought about that perspective, but I think you're probably right as well. Yeah. And I think as well, like, I don't know about you, but there was a lot of chopping and changing when I was that age between like different social workers and different kind of professionals working with me. And something that kind of happened a lot was I would have a social worker for like 6 months, and then I would get a new social worker, and they would like not have any knowledge of my case at all. So I'd have to kind of tell that story again every time. And I think I see a lot of that in the notes as well, where people are kind of reiterating the same things over and over again because there's like that lack of continuity as well.
And for you, like someone that you just said, you've got already quite a fragmented memory of how everything happened, to have to go through that process over and over and over again with different people, like not a recognition from within your local authority that is actually a really bad thing to do, and not right for the child at all, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's all the stuff we talk about, isn't it? It's about like stability, support, continuity of care, which I think just by the nature of how the system is built doesn't happen all the time.
Absolutely.
And that can become really problematic for kids that already perhaps lack stability or, you know, lack continuity with people in their lives and things like that.
Absolutely. So kind of circling back a little bit, you talked about being in foster care. Was that what it was for you the entire time, or did you have other placements in amongst that?
So I was in foster care the entire time. Had 2 placements, which I think is highly unusual.
Yeah.
So I was in one placement initially when we went straight into care, which I remember very, very little of. And then my brother and I were taken into care together, which again is unusual. And we were sent to a second placement because our initial foster parents got pregnant.
Okay.
And the second placement was meant to be a short-term placement, I think 6 to 12 months or something like that. And the plan was that I was sort of 3-ish at the time. I would be put up for adoption, and my brother, who was a bit older, he was 4 or 5, would go into a residential facility. And my foster parents basically advocated for us to stay together. And the result of that was that we ended up staying at that same foster placement for many, many years.
Amazing.
So, like, I totally, all credit to my foster mum for doing that, because I think it's, like, to think of what could have happened to me and my brother. You know, we did have that kind of stability, which I think is quite rare. And it's because we had foster parents that advocated for us and fought to keep us together.
For sure. And like that experience to go through with someone on side that's like also exactly the same, you know, understands it from your point of view, must have been so like big for both of you growing up. Knowing how to understand the situation. Yeah,
for sure. And I don't think I really appreciated it at the time, like what was going on, again, because I was so young, and also I don't know how the care system works, you know, as a kid, but looking back on it now, and also going through my records and seeing the kind of conversations that were going on and the meetings and stuff, like, I just feel like really incredibly lucky that's how it turned out for us. Yeah. Because it's so rare that it does turn out like that. And, you know, when I did get my records, it was my foster mum, who like sat down with me and went through those records with me. And she was able to also add colour to some of what I was reading and kind of say like, I don't think it did happen like that. Or also, oh yes, I do remember that kind of thing. Yeah. So, yeah.
And that's really testament to the relationship that you two have as well, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So you said at the start when we were introducing the episode that you were aged out. So obviously this is a Hooker Scotland podcast, and that's not the sort of terminology that we would use here. So can you explain a little bit about that process and how the support that you were getting from education came into your towards the end of care journey? Yeah. I think I feel like it was 23 that my support stopped, but it was essentially there's kind of different benchmarks in the English care system where your support changes or you move to like a different section of the system. So one is 16 and then it's 18. And I think after 18 is when you're pushed to sort of like start living independently. Yeah. So for us, because we were in this placement, we were told, well, my brother, first of all, because he was older, was told at 18 that he would have to leave the placement. And, you know, my foster parents were kind of like, what the fuck? Yeah. Because I think for us, we didn't really consider ourselves as like foster kids, you know, like staying with the family. We felt like part of the family. So
again, my foster parents kind of pushed for this, and we moved into a kind of supported lodgings type of placement, which meant that we got to stay there.
Oh, fantastic.
And I think essentially it meant that our foster mum, or our mum, we call her mum, was our landlady, which is quite strange to think about. And then after 18, we kind of went into a different portion of the system again, where we had a support worker, and you know there were it was kind of a different level of support. But for me, because I was still in education, the support continued until I was 23. But if I wasn't in education, it would have stopped.
Okay.
At the same time. So.
I see. Okay. And then I think you've kind of recognised it yourself. That's not typically what happens.
Yeah.
So that in a way kind of changed how we would sort of understand it in Scotland. If it was a supported lodge, it would still be another separate placement. So
yeah.
And then you were going on to, was it university that you went to?
Yeah. So I went to uni and I did an undergrad, and then I went on to do a master's.
Oh, amazing.
So that's kind of why I was still in education and still getting the support at 23.
And how did you find being in education and having had care experience? Did that have an impact on your education? Was it?
I think it did in some ways. So one of the things so I went to Brunel University in London, and they had a widening participation department, I suppose you'd call it, and they had kind of someone at the university who was like the dedicated widening participation person, and like there were material things that were really helpful. So when I started university, it was before they stopped doing maintenance grants.
Oh, really?
Yeah, back in the day. So I got the full whack of the maintenance grant, which was like without having to be like means tested and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So things like that, which it's like horrible that they don't do that anymore, because it was so helpful for me. And actually I saved up my maintenance grant, and that's how I paid for my master's and my PhD. So things like that, which was like more of a student loans company thing. And then, do you have free uni in Scotland?
Yeah, tuition fees are free. And then I think our equivalent of the maintenance grant would be the care experience bursary. So we get that.
Yeah.
That's something that Care Scotland campaigned for, obviously. And then you get that throughout the entirety of your university career. So we don't actually have to take out, as a care experience students, we don't have to take out any loans to cover our undergraduate. It's different for our master's degree, but they just recently upped that actually, so it's £9,000 a year you'll get for the entirety of your
amazing.
But
yeah, England not so much. So
different ball game.
Different ball game. So I got a maintenance grant, which was really, it just helped me stay alive basically. And then I also had some support from the local authority financially. So I think I had like basically like pocket money. And they sent me, I can't remember how much it was honestly, but it was sort of like a weekly, it might have even been like 20 or 30 quid a week or something.
That's good.
Which goes a long way, especially in 2011. Not so much nowadays, but so that was really useful. And then in terms of the university, the widening participation team, there was a bursary for care leavers, which I think was one of the first of its kind. And I think they're a lot more common now than they were back when I was starting uni. And then there was other support as well. There were meetups with care experience students. And then when I went on to do my master's and my PhD, I had support, not financial support, but I had a kind of access to the widening participation team, which, you know, would offer things like laptop loans and support with job searches and stuff like that. So there was a sort of framework in place for people, like they recognised that there were additional barriers that care experience people face.
Yeah.
Which I think was really useful for me. I think probably since then, this has kind of become more like there's more awareness around this, and it's higher on universities' agendas.
Definitely.
So I think now there probably would, if I was starting uni now, I think there would be more support and more of an understanding of what it is that care experience people need.
Yeah, and that impact that's been on our education because of the process of going into care in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you received support because you were in university until you were 23. So I think that's a good kind of way to move into the third and final object. And
yeah.
You're representing aftercare and where you are now. You know, you talked a little bit about doing a PhD and you're writing at the start. So tell us a little bit about your final or objects, I guess. There's 3 of them there. But.
So it's a shameless self-plug, really. But I thought about it, and I thought there were a few things I thought I could bring, and one of them I thought about bringing was my house keys, because something I'm really proud of was, you know, getting my own place and moving out and living independently. But I was also thinking about the other things that I've brought, and this idea of kind of telling stories and taking control of your own narrative and things like that. And I think that is something that's really important to me. Yeah. So I brought my books. So I have 3 of them. The first one is Careless, and that is the most explicitly a care story of the 3 of them. There are care experience elements in the other 2, but Careless was the first book I wrote. It was also a book that I wrote at university while I was doing my PhD.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it was when I did my PhD, this book was the sort of majority of the PhD, and then I also did the kind of critical side, which was about looking at other people's representations of care in fiction. And I think it was just something that when I started writing and kind of decided that this was something I wanted to do seriously, I kept coming back to care over and over again. And I was very concerned with, you know, having something original to say as well. Yeah. You know, I felt like if I was writing, it had to be something that I was really passionate about and something I knew a lot about and something I could kind of throw myself into. And that's how I ended up writing Careless. And Careless was published in 2021. And then my second book, Love Me, Love Me Not, came out the following year. And then my next book is called Girls, and that is going to be coming out in May.
How exciting.
It's very exciting, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think this must be such like a reward looking at that. If you said you're really interested in writing, to have 3 of your books on the table there, and like total labour of love as well. It's not an easy process to write a book by all means. I'm sure you could probably talk to that. So I think it makes perfect sense for you to bring in your books as your final object to represent aftercare, because they are like absolutely an achievement, you know.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, I think the other thing is especially with Careless, so much of that writing experience at the same time I was writing Careless, I was getting my records as well. Yeah. And there was so much of myself like tied up into that experience, and I was thinking really deeply about my story and how I wanted to tell it. And Careless kind of, you know, it's a work of fiction, but there is so much of my own identity tied up in those characters. And it became like a really cathartic experience, kind of having my care records on one hand and not seeing myself in them at all, or seeing very little of myself in them, and then being able to kind of just do whatever I wanted and tell the story however I wanted. That was a really powerful and empowering experience for me. And
then for it to be longlisted for an award after all of that must have been like so validating, but you know.
Yeah, it was really validating, and I think the thing that I heard a lot at the time so to be longlisted for that prize meant that that book reached a huge audience that it wouldn't have otherwise reached. You know, it might have sold a few copies, and probably, you know, lots of people who are familiar with the care system or who work in the care system might have read it. But I think what it did was that it went to this kind of mainstream audience where there are lots and lots of people who have never seen the care system written about or talked about in that way.
Yeah.
The thing that I get all the time, and I'm sure you do too, is, oh, you grew up in care. Is that like Tracy Beaker?
Just Jacqueline Wilson again.
Which, like, my experience was nothing like Tracy Beaker's. And I like we could literally do another hour just talking about Tracy Beaker. But like, so you know, having something that people read when their only idea of care was Tracy Beaker, and also the things that you read in the media about people in care as well, you know, that was something that I was really, really proud of.
Yeah.
And, you know, the feedback that I got was, you know, that they'd never thought about it in that way, or they didn't realise that things happened in certain ways and stuff like that. And that was, a really wonderful experience to have.
Yeah, and so like in many ways, I guess it's a service to yourself and that process that you went through to get it out. And you talked about it being a cathartic experience, but it was in many ways a service to the wider care experience people and the wider care experience community, having that like prize happen or the long listing for the award happening, bringing it to that new audience, and them getting an unfiltered version, even though it was fiction, unfiltered version of what it was like to be in care. And I'm the same as you. I've been in this field for a long time talking about things, but I think the power that something like fiction and creative industries in general have is it puts those kind of stories, as you said, into people's hands, and they start to consider it in a way that they would never have considered before. And that's kind of why the representations of Tracy Beaker, sort of circling back, are so hard for us as a community, because people take it as sort of face value. So what you've did with Careless is sort of taken back that control, not just on behalf of yourself but on behalf of the wider care experience community. And I think a lot of people will look at that and see you as a kind of role model for taking back the power and saying, well, this is how we're going to tell our stories. It's not going to be done by someone that actually wasn't in care for the first place, but also it's going to be like real and means tested, and you know, not just how people view what the process of care is like. So I think that's amazing.
Oh, thank you, that's really nice of you to say.
No, it definitely is.
I think that it's also that it can't just be like one moment, it has to be like a continuous like process of like education and agitation and advocacy. And I think, unfortunately, the problem with the publishing industry is that it's very trends focused. And I think publishing has a lot to kind of reckon with in terms of how it works with people from marginalised and underrepresented backgrounds and how it tells those stories. And I think there are other authors out there who are doing like incredible things in fiction and memoir, in telling stories about care experience, but there just needs to be more of them. And there needs to be care experience voices there too. I think, you know, going back to Jacqueline Wilson, she's not care experience, so to have the one kind of salient representation of care in our kind of like mainstream popular culture to be from someone who hasn't experienced it themselves is like really problematic. So, and that's not to say that people who haven't experienced something can't write about it, because I think everyone should be able to write about whatever they want, but I think it's about how we platform those voices. And I think there needs to be more focus from people and institutions that have that power to make a concerted effort to platform voices from marginalised groups, whether it's care experience people or whether it's other communities as well.
Yeah, I think that really ties into a wider conversation about representation as a whole in the creative industries. It's not just the people that are outputting stories, like making sure that there's care experienced authors or care experienced playwrights or care experienced like writers in general, but it's throughout the whole industry.
Yeah,
making sure that there's people in publishing, whatever level it is, that are care experienced. So when someone does come in, or from any sort of marginalised background, making sure that they're out through every level. So when they do come in, there's always going to be someone in that publishing place being like, actually, we should fight for this voice because,
absolutely,
because that makes it much easier to break down those barriers if there's someone within the institution sort of fighting our corners anyway. So
I totally agree.
How do we get those opportunities to happen? It's a much bigger conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that is really important.
And I think as well, it's also not just about like telling stories of your experience as well. I think the thing that I've come across a lot, kind of going through the industry as a writer, but also working in the industry, is like this idea of kind of like mining your own trauma for content, which I think happens a lot because, and I think it to a certain extent it's understandable because it's a life that isn't in the mainstream. It's an experience that not many people know about, and there's a lot of value in telling those stories and giving them the space to go to that mainstream audience. But I think there's also the other side of that is people who are from these backgrounds who don't want to talk about their own experience or don't want to kind of delve into things that have happened to them to inform their creative outputs. I think it's also just as important to platform people from marginalised backgrounds who just want to write like sci-fi or romantasy or something. And I think there it's about a question of access and giving people the opportunities to access an industry that is typically quite closed off to them because of, because of the issues around education and, class and things like that. Yeah.
And that starts like right at the very start of someone's journey of becoming a writer, doesn't it? It's making sure that there's equal opportunity and equal access from the very point of, say, at university or in school, and what comes next and what opportunities come after university, all those kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's part of a wider conversation that we're all having actually in Scotland and even in England and in Wales. It's sort of feeds into that whole country approach. We've got this very much narrative in Scotland with the promise. It's like it takes a village to raise a child, but that needs to go further than just being a child. It's like what happens in supporting an adult when they're care experienced, and how can we all do that. I think we're kind of coming towards the end of the podcast. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I think there's been
me too.
really important things that were said that needed to be out there that we actually haven't had on our podcast yet, so I think that's fantastic. Before we finish up, I just want to ask, we do this for every guest, and I'd love to hear what it was like for you to be on, and if you were encouraging someone else that was maybe considering coming on and wanting to go through the process of being on Objects, what sort of advice would you have for them?
It's been a really lovely experience, so thank you for inviting me. I think for me it was just it was really thinking about what I was going to bring was like the bit that I found the most difficult, because I think there's so many different directions that you can go in. So I think probably I would say to someone who was going to come on, think about what you want to say, like what story do you want to tell, and think about objects that might help you to say that or tell that story. And I think that was the most useful thing for me when I was looking at what I wanted to bring. But it's been really wonderful. So
amazing.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a brilliant conversation. So
thank you.
Great.